Well, good morning, good afternoon to everybody on the call. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the April 22 session of how to become a GWO training provider. These sessions will be recorded, so if you want to come back and watch it again later, also for people who maybe weren't able to attend this session, it'll be available shortly after this through the Zoom link. So here's the agenda today. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with GWO in North America, address some of the training provider opportunities in the region, talk about how to become a GWO training provider. That's really the bulk of what we're going to be talking about today. And towards the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session for you to raise any questions that you have that weren't specifically addressed in this webinar. So a few tips on Zoom. You're going to see that you maybe don't have some of the Zoom settings that you're used to. We disable a lot of those things for webinars. There is a raise hand icon that you can click on if you have any specific needs. You cannot speak unless the moderator, myself, or my colleague who's assisting with this unmutes your line. But you can type in the chat window and we will be able to see that throughout the session. As I mentioned, the sessions are being recorded and you can watch these on demand. You can share the registration link with anybody and even they can register tomorrow, get in there, watch the video and see that. And we'll also be recording, chopping these up and putting them on YouTube as well. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions that come up, use the Q&A window. We will be addressing those at the end of the webinar. And also, if you want to watch the questions that are coming in, if you have a similar question or you like the question, you can promote it and it pushes it to the top of the pile and gets it right in front of us. But we'll do our best to answer all the questions that come in at the end. So let's get kicked off and talk about how things are going for GWO in North America. First, for those of you who have not met me in person, my name is Dan Ortega. One of the newer members of the Global Wind Organization team. I'm actually their first employee based here in the United States. My role is I'm the North American Regional Representative. I drive the growth and the standardization of training in this region. I work with our North American Committee and associated working groups in this region. We work together to grow and promote GWO within organizations, within training providers, all of that. And, just generally representing GWO as a spokesperson. I attend a lot of conferences. So if you're ever going to a wind energy conference, there's a high likelihood that I'm going to be there. So go ahead and shoot me a message and we'll, at the very least, shake hands while we're there. Prior to working for GWO, I worked for Vestas for 15 years. The last 10 years of it, I was a senior manager over technical and safety training for the North American region. And then the first 5 years I worked for Vestas, I was a site operations manager out in Southeast Washington, managed wind projects in Washington, Oregon, Tennessee, and on the island of Hawaii over those 5 years. I'm based just outside of Portland, Oregon. As I mentioned, I'm in the region for the region, within the time zones. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me and we'll talk about how to contact me throughout this. GWO is a member-led organization. The organizations listed on this screen are our member organizations that are represented in the North American region. These are large players in the wind industry. The membership criteria is that they have 1,000 or more technicians in the wind industry, or they own or operate more than 1 gigawatt of wind turbines. And then they also have a commitment to implement and promote GWO training wherever appropriate. We're looking to expand this. We're talking to a lot of large owner operators in the United States to gain their influence in the GWO, because as a member, not only are they represented, but they can drive the agenda. They're the ones that set our priorities around training development, amount new products that we deliver, about which training we need to revise to meet the needs or the changes of the industry. And so they all are represented on the various GWO committees, including the executive committee, the training committee, the audit and compliance committee, and then the regional committees like our North American committee. So some opportunities that you have as a training provider in this region. I like to talk first about our value proposition. GWO isn't just a training product. It's really there to achieve a few things. And first and foremost is to really increase the standard of safety training across the industry. As more and more organizations are accepting GWO, looking at GWO as the standard that they're using to achieve their safety training needs, we're recognizing that, for some parts of the industry, and keep in mind, this is a global training standard. It is actually, increasing the standard of safety. One of the big benefits is the productivity, because as organizations accept GWO training, it often becomes essentially like a ticket to entry. You need to have this training in order to get on the job site. And because of our online window database, people can verify that training very quickly as the technicians are coming on site. And so what it's doing is really eliminating a lot of redundant training, giving the opportunity for a technician to show up on site, have their training validated, get a site orientation and equipment orientation, and they can go right to work. And that's achieved through that third bullet point, which is standardization. There's a lot of standard setting bodies, things like ANSI, whatnot, but we deliver a standardized training that is meant to meet those standards. And so anytime a standard comes out, an industry consensus standard, we look to make sure that the GWO training meets all of the requirements of that standard and is a standardized tool by which you achieve that training standard. The other aspect is that locally sourced training. There are training providers all over the country, but you talk to a lot of people and they're sending their technicians on flights to different places. And as GWO expands across the region, we're getting more and more training providers close to where the training is needed. You look at the map of the United States, and I'll show that here in a moment for the opportunities, and people are still pretty spread out. But then you look at it in Europe, who's about 5 years maybe ahead of us as far as GWO implementation. In the areas where there's a lot of wind turbines and wind technicians, there are GWO training providers available right there, which it really helps with the cost effectiveness and the speed at which technicians can receive not only their initial training, but their refresher training. And then that last bullet, alignment. Supply chain, usually people think of buying parts and stuff like that, but part of supply chain is contractor agreements. And so what we're seeing a lot in the industry is, especially as some of those larger member organizations are setting GWO training as a contractor requirement, it's actually creating a lot of alignment so that people can come to the table on an RFP for contract labor, maintenance support and stuff like that. And it just removes that hurdle of proving your safety program, proving your technician training. It really streamlines the process because everybody knows exactly what they're talking about, again, because that standardization of the training. And you look at what GWO training has in our portfolio. This is a growing portfolio on a regular basis. In fact, as I'm looking at this, I realize there's 3 more modules, that I can add to this list. But you can divide them up into kind of 4 quadrants. You have your core modules, which there's a safety and a technical component to that. And then there's the task-specific modules, which can also be divided into safety and technical. Our recommendation, ultimately, it's the organization's duty to determine what the minimum training requirements are. But our recommendation is that all technicians who work on a wind turbine on a daily basis have the core modules. And the one that's soon to be added to that list is the control of hazardous energy. The task-specific modules are really recommended based off of the job profile. Certain organizations require certain technicians based off of numbers or skill level to be rescue capable. Or if you're going to be calling a crane, they want you to be a rigger signal person, blade repair, another example. But for all of the training in the safety column, they all have a refresher requirement of 2 years. So there is an ongoing training demand for anything in that safety quadrant. You might ask, where do we come up with the training? And it's really designed around the risks that the technicians encounter on a day-to-day basis as they enter the turbine. And on top of that is not just the risks that they encounter, but we actually do work with industry organizations who are tracking incident data. So where do we see the most incidents in wind turbines? And that's really where we start targeting our training development. And these are the top 25. We're actually going through an exercise this year with different large organizations to expand this and make it a little bit more granular. So again, based off of incident data. And if we're having a high number of incidents in a certain area, we want to be able to have a training program that has learning objectives that are designed to address that specific aspect. And so if you look across this top 25, 17 of those are covered in some way, shape, or form by GWO training. So that's a pretty good coverage for the industry. And then if you dive in a little bit more specifically into North America, we worked with all of our North American member organizations to identify what training are they requiring for technicians coming in the door. In a mature market like the United States, things have kind of like coalesced around titles of training. And so you see things in there like PPE, fall protection and evacuation, dropped object prevention, first aid CPR, electrical safety awareness and stuff like that. And what you see in the left side of the screen is that with the exception of those bottom 3 modules, right now GWO training is covering a vast majority of that minimum entry training. Some of those HASCOM WMIS, most organizations, will cover that through some sort of like e-learning or on-site training combination. A lot of training available. We don't want to step in and try to recreate something that may already be well established. Hoist training, lifting the tools on a daily basis into the wind turbine, that's on a training development plan for the next couple of years. And so we'll see that one coming out here within near time frame. And then the last one, confined space awareness basics. Admittedly, that's one of the more contentious subjects with regards to safety in wind turbines. And so there's some debate about whether or not, how that could be covered. But I do know a lot of organizations who recognize that, have their own training programs or are utilizing, some kind of off-the-shelf products. But nonetheless, with the stuff that's covered in white, that's about 10 days of new technician training covered just by those GWO core modules, which is pretty substantial when you're looking at it. And so, as organizations are hiring technicians that have GWO training already under their belt, as they're looking at, technical schools and colleges that they tend to source their trained technicians from, if those organizations are also moving over to GWO training, that's a ticket to entry. I mean, any one of the community colleges that I've talked to, and I, see a couple people that I recognize on the list here, they're all about placement. They want to give the training that the industry needs. And if they can get their technicians if they can get their graduates what the industry is asking for, and it's certified and recognized, they're meeting their core objective in their training programs. And then on the right side of the screen, you see a lot of the other training that came up pretty regularly around rescue training. A lot of that is covered by GWO training with the exception of the confined space entry element of it. And then some of the task specific items in there. So you can see, if we were talking about this 10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about GWO not really covering fully what the technician needs. But you can see now we're talking about a significant portion through standardized training that a technician can receive through multiple training providers. And so it's a significant advantage for users across the industry. And one of the biggest advantages is the fact that, a standard is, an ANSI standard, an ACP standard like that, they're great tools, but if they're not validated, if they're not certified, they're only as good as the people who are using them and the word of which they're saying that they're using them. But GWO has an audit trail. It's very similar to an ISO certification process, and we'll talk a lot about that. And so in order for somebody to upload their training record into our online training database, which is called WINDA, they have to be a certified training provider. In order to become a certified training provider, they have to go through an audit with an approved certification body. And so there's this trail of accountability that when the technician shows up at your site, you know it's not just anybody who has delivered this training. And from a training provider perspective, that's a guarantee that you're giving to the industry, is that you've gone through all of that certification process and you can offer that guarantee of quality to that to the employer of the technician. And anytime a technician takes training, as their training gets uploaded into the WINDA database, they have this training record that moves with them. As long as you have the technician's WINDA ID, you can pull their record out of the system. You can import it into your system. If you have a large organization, you might even look at doing a electronic connection between the GWO WINDA database and your learning management system, so the records are just automatically transferred. So there's a lot of options in there, and it really increases the flexibility again. So looking at the growth, this is looking at the last 3 years of GWO in the United States. And what you see on the blue bar graph there is the number of modules that have been delivered year over year. And then in 2022, we have Q1 data. And so what I did is just extrapolated it out for the full year. And then that orange line is showing the number of participants that were trained with the chart on the right-hand axis of the screen. And so what you're seeing is just this year over year growth. We're looking at about this last year, we trained about a little over 5,000 technicians. And to put that in perspective, there's varying numbers out there, but there's somewhere in the range of 40 to 50,000 wind technicians in the United States. And so if we're training at about 5,000 per year last year, you can see the opportunity as more and more organizations are moving to GWO training. And then if you add on top of that, the growth of wind over the next several years, particularly in the offshore sector, these numbers are going to grow and grow and grow. And so there's a lot of opportunity. And in fact, we set a goal in the North American working group region to have about 8,400 technicians trained this year and 50,000 modules delivered. And what's interesting about that too is you notice how that orange line gets closer to the bar graph. And what that's actually indicating is what we're seeing is that technicians are receiving more GWO modules per training event. Back in 2019, 2020, most people were just receiving, say, the BST core modules, which is 4 modules. But now we're seeing a lot more technicians get the BST core plus maybe ART, or also getting BTT or something like that. And so, it's a both kind of horizontal and vertical growth of how many modules each technician is receiving, plus how many technicians are receiving said modules. Okay. And so what this is looking at is a map of the United States. And you can see that those green areas, this is actually taken from the US wind turbine database, and the website address is there on the bottom. If you're a map geek like I am, go check it out. It's fun. You could literally tell the latitude and longitude of every single wind turbine in the United States. But what I did was I overlaid our training provider locations against this map. And what this does is kind of gives you a sense of opportunity. Where are you based? What's the density of wind turbines in your area? I mean, you probably have a pretty good understanding of, how many wind turbines are in a 50 to 100 mile radius of your location. But you can see there's some significant areas of opportunity. I mean, South Texas, Central Texas, Oklahoma, I mean, basically the whole wind belt through Kansas and Iowa up into Minnesota. Not a lot of training providers covering those areas. Illinois, Indiana, ton of density in the central part of those states there, and presently no training providers. And so, if you're in an area and that there are organizations that are using or considering GWO training in your area, I encourage you to reach out to them and start having that dialogue, form partnerships, let them know that you're considering it. They may even be willing to help fund it in some way, shape, or form. I know a lot of our member organizations would love training partners that want to build a training program to meet their needs, and in some cases are willing to help provide equipment or parts or design of structures and stuff like that. So don't think you have to do this alone. Start reaching out to the industry and seeing what they need. All right, so I'm going to shift gears here and talk about the meat of this webinar is how to become a GWO training provider. And in order to get this going, I want to launch a poll. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this first poll, and I want everybody to take a moment and answer these questions. And so, how far along the journey towards GWO certification is your organization? And the second question is, how soon does your organization plan to get certified to deliver GWO training? And so that poll should be popping up on your screen right now. Take a look at it. I see some people are answering. And I'll go ahead and actually bring that over to our screen so that we can see what answers we're getting. So a few people are in the kind of starting the process, doing the business case analysis or taking steps towards certification. Have a couple already certified training providers on the call. That's cool. I know people are always looking for more information. How soon does your organization plan to get certified? Q3 looks like the cool month. Or quarter, excuse me, 2023 and later. Okay. All right, looks like it's slowing down a little bit. We have about 15 answers and 22 attendees, so we're about 3/4 of the way there. That poll should stay up for a few moments, even while I progress with the presentation. So I would have just asked that, just take a moment and answer those questions. It's, really good information for us, helps us connect with you and figure out how we can help you. So one of the first things as you're getting into the process of considering how to become certified is getting familiar with our website. We're very forthcoming with all of our information. It's right there on our website. Sometimes it is a little bit of a shopping adventure to know where to look, what to click on, where to find some of the resources. What you'll see is across the top of the website, on the top banner, you have links to our training standards, and that's where all of the documents around basic safety, about basic technical training, all of the learning objectives are defined in those training standards, and I'll go into depth on those here in a little bit. The next one is training providers, and that's where the requirements for training providers is located, and that's essentially the standard by which that you as a prospective training provider are going to be judged against with the auditor on site, to see if you have all the systems and processes and training in place to become a certified training provider. The tab there for certification bodies is where we keep our requirements for certification bodies. I find a lot when I'm talking to people about the certification process that not too many people think about going and looking at that section of the website. And I encourage you to take a look at it, because you get a little bit of an insight on what's required of a certification body, but then it also has certain things of like them setting up the audit. What are their requirements for the duration of the audit? Which portions of it, need to be on site? Which portions can they do a surveillance on versus a full in-depth audit? And actually, there's a section in there specifically about setting up the audit process. And so I really encourage you to take a look at that as you're taking steps towards the certification. And then that last, the three parallel lines there has a lot of stuff under there, but the three key ones is one is our help center. And so there's a lot of like FAQ documents in there about, questions that we receive a lot that help you kind of dig in and understand certain elements of the certification process. There's a link in there to contact GWO. We have a general mail called info@globalwindsafety.org. You can send any question in there. You'll usually get a prompt response from the ticket system, potentially answering your question, but then within about 24 hours, you'll get a response from a real person that will give a little bit more of a detailed answer based off of what you're looking for. And then there's also the connection in there to go into Winda and create profiles, create employer profiles, all of that stuff. And so I really do encourage you to spend some time getting to know the website and where the documents are located. And I mentioned specifically the requirements for training providers is the document by which you will be judged as you're going through your certification process. And you see, if you click on the top bar link and then that second tab within it, which is the requirements for training providers, you can download the document right there and print it out for your own use. I will mention that in the requirements for certification bodies, very similar flow to get to the documents, there's actually a template in there for the certifiers to use to document the certification process that they do with you. You can print that out as a training provider and use it essentially as a cheat sheet, so you can systematically go through and ensure that you are prepared for every element of the audit process. And so we're very forthcoming with our documents. Nothing is hidden. Sometimes it might be hard to find. Always reach out to info@Global Wind Safety if you have questions about it, or reach out to me directly. But everything is right there on our website. And so when you start diving into the process about certification, there's 4 key elements to our certification process, and you see them there on your screen: the physical resources, the management systems, the staff, instructor resources, and your training and assessment program. A lot of people tend to jump to the training curriculum development, which is obviously the very important aspect of it, because that is the product that you're putting out in front of your training participants. But all of these other elements are really the foundation under which your training program rests. And so if you don't have solid processes in place for management systems, documented, designs and, and inspections for your physical resources, and documented processes for your instructor development, you can't really say you have a quality training program. You may deliver good training, but quality means that you have repeatable processes, documented processes, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to walk through each one of these elements. And just to confuse you, I'm actually going to start with B, because I believe, just from my own experience, that the management systems is really the bedrock of the foundation. And so this is section 7 in the requirements for training providers document. It really outlines what is considered your quality management system for ensuring the quality and the content of the training and assessment, the compliance with the GWO requirements and standards, all of the things that you have to set in place in order to have that bedrock of your training program. If your organization has gone through an ISO certification, they spend a lot of time looking at your management systems, so it's very similar to that process. But as a minimum, your supporting processes have to include descriptions of your organization with roles and responsibilities, how you handle your training records, and processes for risk assessments, nonconformities, and incident reporting. And we'll look at each one of those. So in the organization responsibilities, roles and responsibilities, what they're looking for is definitions of roles assigned to each element of your GWO certification. So who in your organization is responsible for what part of your training program, whether it be training development, administration, management, oversight, etc. Documented regular reviews by your senior management. This isn't just a training department activity. This is a commitment of your organization to adopt this standardized training. How you perform internal audits. It's not just the external audits that come in and audit your training program. It's that ongoing internal review, both instructor observations, review of your programs, etc. And how do you control your documents? What kind of document control procedures do you have in place? The second element is the handling of the training records, learning management systems. Where do you keep the records of your technicians' completion? There's a requirement in there to upload any completed GWO training within the Windows system of 10 days of completion. And so you should have a process in place to define how you do that. And then how do you keep track of refresher training? The GWO system will the Windows system, will send out notifications within certain periods of the reminders, but that's sent to the individual. But within your organization, you should have some sort of system or process in place that reaches out and triggers people to say, hey, we need to schedule a refresher training. And then the third element there is your risk assessment process. How do you handle nonconformities and incidents? The risk assessments, we don't talk a lot about risk assessments. I've found, in my years in the industry, in the US, it's not as common of a term, but what a risk assessment is really that step back evaluation of what's the severity of the risk, what's the likelihood of the risk based off of the activities that you're going to perform either in this job or in this location. And then a really detailed review of that, and then mitigation plans for each one of those elements. And then that's being reviewed by the management so that they're aware of the risks that are at that location, or again, that job site. What do you do when you have non-conformities, issues where you have a process, you have a procedure, but something didn't go per that process, or you have a deviation for that process? What's your corrective action program? What do you do when you have a customer complaint, or a technician attends a class and has a really, really bad experience? What is your process for handling that? Who's responsible for it? You have to have participant satisfaction surveys in place, and those results need to be published and viewable for others to see, so they can get an assessment of whether or not this is the training program that they want to use. And then lastly, what do you do when you have an incident report? How do you document incident reports? How does it reflect in your management system? What is your corrective action process? And all of these have to not only be defined, but have some element of evidence that it's being used, and this is what the process looks like. I've heard it said that a quality management system is really kind of boiled down to saying what you do and doing what you say. And so if you really think of those two elements in your management system, I think you'll be heading in the right direction. Section 8 of the requirements for training providers defines the training equipment and resources that you need to have. And really what this requirements for training providers is geared towards is how do you maintain said equipment. Each one of the training standards themselves are going to define the equipment that you need in order to deliver that training. But then under that is the requirements for training providers around how do you make sure it adheres to applicable legislation and standards. Depending upon where you are, you may have to have an engineer stamp on working at height structures. GWO is always going to defer to the local requirements, but the GWO requirements dictate that you have to follow those local requirements. You have to have elements in your practical training that have some sort of level of realism. So it's like working in a wind turbine environment. Not everybody has to get in a cell to do the training, but you can get creative with the way that you do things, even down to measuring how far a ladder is away from a wall so that your technician get the feel of leaning into a wall or something like that. Those kind of things, getting actual ladders that they use in wind turbines. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can get equipment that, helps create that realism. And then again, as we mentioned before, is that you should have risk assessments documented for any structures, any components that are being used during the training. It also goes into the requirements around the different types of facilities that you can have. And so GWO calls out 4 different types of facilities. One is the fixed facility. It's kind of the traditional permanent location where you do your training on a regular basis. There's a picture of that, on the right-hand side of the screen. But some organizations also use mobile training facilities. Maybe it's a Connex box, maybe it's some sort of truck-mounted tilt-up structure that you take to, a parking lot adjacent to an O&M building or something like that. That's essentially like a fixed training facility, except it's on wheels. And so that has a different risk assessment, has a different certification process that goes with it. The other one is on-site training. And on-site training can be either training in a location that is not the primary fixed facility. So say you go to another training center that also does working at heights training or something like that, but has not gone through a GWO facility certification. You can use that location if you're certified to do on-site training. And what it does is you essentially go to that facility, go through a checklist to evaluate that it meets all of the criteria to do the training, and then you document that review, you document the risk assessments for that facility, and then you can essentially release it for GWO training. This also works on a wind turbine for field training. A lot of people are looking at ways to utilize actual wind turbines for training, particularly around refresher training. Again, it's just a process to go in and evaluate that location to be suitable to meet the learning objectives of training, have the specific safety elements in place before you just start using it. And the 4th domain for training is digital learning. And that doesn't really seem like a location or a site per se, but it's a recognition that it is really a different learning environment. And there are a lot of different ways that people complete digital or digitalized learning. It could be e-learning, remote training, webinars, virtual classrooms, augmented reality, virtual reality, some sort of blend between all of those things. It's just growing. And so we had to include a section in there. And what you're really doing is you're working with the auditor to make sure that the elements of the learning module that you're completing, say maybe it's working at heights, that you're actually achieving those learning objectives in this digital environment. And then oftentimes, depending upon how you're doing this digital learning, if you're only, say, achieving the knowledge learning objectives in the digital environment, how does that couple with your physical training that may be subsequent to that? So some people will do online e-learning for completing certain elements of the knowledge learning, and they do that within a certain number of days and then bring the technician into a physical training center, and then they jump off from that point, do a quick refresher, and then boom, they're right there doing physical training. We've seen others who that have full on virtual headsets and even arm things to sense heat, and they do firefighting training in a virtual environment, or calling cranes and doing signals and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of different opportunities there, and people are constantly pushing the boundaries too. Each one of these types of site locations has to have an individual audit, but it can be bundled into a multi-site audit. And there's a lot of changes in the language around multi-site audits in the most recent update to our requirements for training providers. We're even working on some more changes because a lot of things that we had to consider. But the message is, you can actually bundle multiple fixed facilities or different training sites into a single audit with a certification body. The next area is around instructor qualifications. And so there's some requirements in there. I just took a sampling of some of the requirements that are kind of high points around, some of the prerequisites for selecting an instructor. They have to have prior teaching experience that, could be on other training, doesn't necessarily have to be GWO training, but we're really trying to get people who have, the necessary knowledge, not only in, adult education, but with the equipment that they're going to use. So, it says possess appropriate qualifications and experience for the modules taught and receive some level of appropriate instructor qualification training. Things around ongoing competence, familiarization with the specific training, including working in a turbine. You want to get people exposed to the environment. Sometimes we're, taking people from, say, the medical industry or like EMT background, great instructors, but maybe they don't really know much about a wind and turbine environment. So you want to give them that exposure so they can, synthesize that information as they're delivering the training. As an instructor is getting qualified, you don't want it to be too prolonged. You really want it to be within about a 6-month period, and they need to continually teach the course at least every 12 months and be observed teaching that course as part of your quality management system every 12 months. And then the instructors need to show that they can comply with the requirements and learning objectives of the training standards, be familiar with them, and then comply with the GWO code of conduct. So instructor development process, the GWO standard outlines essentially kind of, I call it like the 0 to hero process, taking somebody who's coming into your organization and you're building them from a starting employee into a qualified instructor. And that's where these 4 steps get outlined. And, they need to participate in the modules that they're going to teach. They need to observe those being taught by an experienced instructor. They need to go through a process of co-delivering under the supervision of an experienced instructor. And then their final qualification step is delivering the full course under observation. Now, you may have already qualified instructors. Maybe you have an existing training program that you're modifying to meet the GWO standards or kind of follow the flow of a GWO training. There are alternate approaches to that. What it says is basically those first 3 steps can be, done through other processes. You just have to be able to show that your instructors have gone through familiarization with the course material, they've done practical teaching hours, but that final step, that step 4, that final observation is really always, regardless of an alternate approach or the primary approach, is the culmination of the process of that qualification. If you have an existing training program that you're going through a gap analysis and adding the components of GWO training, or you're finding that you're really meeting a lot of the learning objectives of GWO training, but you're switching over to get certified to GWO training, reach out to me. I'll work with you on making sure that you have all of that documented, because you can present the prior qualifications of your instructors as part of that alternate approach to achieving qualification. So you don't have to put everyone through the quote 0 to hero process. You're already several steps down the process. You just need to be able to document and demonstrate that. And I've been working with a lot of training providers to do that. And then, as I say there on the bottom, working with other GWO training providers for instructor development is an effective means for initial qualification. Sometimes that is challenging because it might be a competitor. But again, if you want some guidance or some contacts, reach out to me. Sometimes people utilize large multinational providers, and maybe they'll go to another location across the country, maybe even into another country to do their qualification, just so they're not kind of asking somebody in their backyard. The next element is the training and assessment. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people kind of jump to this as the first part, because this is the customer facing element of your program. What you really need to get familiar with is the individual training standards. These are very long documents. They define all of the minimum requirements for the course. They include things like who's your target group, what are their prerequisites. Not a lot of the GWO training has particular prerequisites, but when you start getting into some of the task specific or advanced rescue training, they have to have certain elements before that, so that they come in at a known competency level. How long does a training last, and when are the refreshers for those safety components? What are the aims and objectives? What's the minimum course duration? The timetables for the modules. What equipment do you need? What are the ratios? There are defined maximum instructor to participant ratios, so that you don't have a class of 20 people in one instructor. And then the real bulk of the standard is those learning objectives and the taxonomy descriptions. How do you actually achieve the learning objective? And then how do you assess your participants? It could be testing, it could be practical examinations, but it all has to be assessed and documented. Our training program is not, the GWO training is not an off-the-shelf product that you just need to plug into your PowerPoint and go. It is a list of learning objectives that need to be achieved in your training. And so you see an example of a snip of the Working at Heights module from the BST. This is just one element of it. It says the learning objective is that the participants can perform the correct attachment of random vertical fall arrest gliders or sliders to the matching rail or wire. And that's saying it's a skill intermediate level. And then they also need to be able to perform the correct attachment of random, that looks like a repeat. So what it's saying there is they need to be able to perform this activity. And then you see below that just some more details on what the instructor needs to do and what the participant physically needs to achieve. And so what you see is a division of taxonomy, and that's saying, what are the action verbs that give you an indication of how the technician needs to be able to accomplish an action to achieve this learning objective? And you see things in there like perform, explain, practice. In each one of these standards, there's a guide on the taxonomy levels, because each one of those words have a very specific meaning. Practice says they need to be able to show this on repeated occasions. Demonstrate says they show it to somebody else without a lot of guidance. And each one of the standards includes the taxonomy. And actually, there's a recent 3-part video that was put out that explains the GWO taxonomy for all of those different elements and how you can utilize that as you're building your training program. There are also timetables in each one of the GWO standards. These are approximate durations of each component of this. You see there's all the different learning elements in each one of the lessons. You can choose to deliver these elements in any order that you want, as long as you're meeting the minimum time duration and that you are not reducing the length of the practical elements of the training. This is oddly one of the sometimes very contentious elements of certification. This is a minimum requirement. And really what it's saying is that you have to be able to show that you're at least covering this as a minimum. What you want to do beyond that is really up to you. If it says 15 minutes on this, you could spend 30 minutes on it if you want. And you can, again, the theoretical elements, you could choose to deliver them with the practical exercises. That's perfectly fine. But this is, the auditor will spend a little time just making sure that you're meeting the minimum elements of this. And it's not only just watching the course being delivered, but it is in your instructor guides to help your instructors be consistent from one person to the next and one class to the next. And I always recommend take some time to look at the annex on the back. That's where it lists the equipments that you're going to need per module, what applicable regulations. It could be European regulations and US regulations. There's usually guides for warm-up exercises per module in there. And then sometimes it has specific guides on various elements because, we've just took some learnings from different training providers and shared those across the industry. The equipment needs, I will call specifically out on that. Rarely does it say that you need this specific product. It will usually give you classifications of product, like a constant rate descent device. Maybe you need 2 different ones, or a magnetically controlled contactor for the BTT electrical module. You can choose what product it is. It just has to fit into that product category so that you can achieve the learning objectives. Now, stepping into the process of the audit. So I just talked through the 4 elements of what the auditor is going to look at. But when you actually connect with an auditor and schedule your audits, you're going to see 2 things on your initial certification audit. You're going to have a stage 1 audit, which is essentially a readiness review of the 4 elements to determine your preparedness. It's essentially like a courtesy audit to help you figure out if you're heading in the right direction. It's a much lower barrier to entry than a full audit, because then the stage 2 audit, has to be at the facility that's being audited. It's going to cover every single site that is included in your audit and every single module that you're going to be certifying to. They have to observe classroom and practical training, and then that certification is going to last for 2 years. And so when you connect with your auditor, they're going to determine how many facilities, how many modules, and they'll go through and they'll determine how long your audit the duration of your audit to be able to cover all of those elements. And that is an on-site audit. For the ongoing review, so as it says there, your certification lasts for 2 years, but at the 1-year interval in between, and there's a kind of a plus and minus on that, you'll have a surveillance audit. And so essentially what they're doing is they're just looking at continued quality and compliance of the delivery. They're really looking at, because a lot of times when you're doing your initial audit, you have a lot of processes in place, but you don't necessarily have a lot of evidence in place that you've achieved those. And so the surveillance audit is an opportunity for them to check in and see how those are being done. And there are some provisions in there about doing those remotely. Work with your auditor on that. And then a renewal audit is done every 2 years, and it's essentially the same requirements as the initial audit. I get asked a lot by people, how much is this going to cost me? And the simple answer is it really depends upon where you're starting from. I put the costs into 3 buckets on this screen, and they go from most variability to the least variability, from left to right. And so you see on the left, setup and maintenance. A lot of that's going to be around what kind of investment are you going to have to make? What kind of costs are you going to incur to set up your training program to meet those 4 elements that we just walked through? That could be, purchasing a facility, doing your structure design, building your structures and setting up, all your components. What kind of equipment do you need to purchase? Harnesses, lanyards, fall protection, emergency descent devices, etc. Do you have management systems in place, or do you need to develop them from scratch? Do you have training material already developed, or do you have to work with training developers either within your own organization or maybe outside your organization to get the training material up to the GWO standards? And how are you going to develop your instructors, or do you train the trainers? And then kind of the final piece of that is you might consider going down the route of utilizing external consultants or partnerships. And so there's a cost associated with that. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. The next one is the audit process. And so when you reach out to a certification body, I do encourage you to reach out to a couple different ones. We have a few in the United States and get some comparison bids, because we don't dictate what they charge for their auditors. They usually charge the travel costs and then a day rate for the audit. And so, where they are may dictate that. Even if you're looking at the list of auditors and, maybe they're located in Denver and Houston and you're like way up in, I don't know, Michigan or something like that, give them a call anyway, because that's where their home office is. They may have auditors that are distributed across the US, because these are kind of, mobile nomadic people. And I do recommend you contact them early in the process, because they have a backlog. You might want to kind of do a little bit of shopping early, determine, what their availability is and what that frames as far as your timeline for the process. And then far on the right is the GWO fees. These are really basic. You're gonna see two different ways you get charged by GWO to be a certified training provider. One is an annual licensing fee of 650 euros, which right now I think is somewhere between $720 and $740. It's not a huge fee. We make it the minimum fee that we can in order to maintain our nonprofit status. But where the ongoing cost is in order to maintain our Windows system and keep that online database going, we do charge €9.20, which right now is about 1070 American, every time you upload a training record into the Windows system. For-profit training providers usually pass that cost on to their participants or the employer of the participants. It's a fairly minimal cost, but that's really where GWO gets our operating revenue. Again, we are a nonprofit. We have very strict criteria about how much money that we, collect and maintain in the bank. So, put out of your mind any idea that we're making money off of this. This is really just our operating expense to keep the business running, employ training developers to maintain our standards and develop the next standards and such and whatnot. Now, I had some conversations with a few of the auditors based in the US and asking them, like, what are some of the things that they see pretty regularly as they're going to visit training providers for certification audits? And they came up with a pretty good list that I wanted to share with you. I talked earlier about the taxonomy levels, the different things around define, describe, demonstrate, perform, practice. They often find that instructors don't really understand that very well and can't really explain how they confirm that their participants have met that learning objective based off of the taxonomy level. And I think that has a little bit to do with, one of the ones over there on the right-hand side of the screen is that they tend to also see a lot of training providers that don't have instructors that have a lot of pedagogical training. And so that's the science of teaching people, whether adult education or elementary education, but there is a science, there's a methodology to how do you impart knowledge to individuals. And that seems to be lacking in a lot of training providers as well. I mean, just because somebody is a really, really good wind technician doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a really great instructor. It's an investment process. It's a training process. They also see that internal audits are inconsistent and often not objective and impartial, meaning that a lot of times it's people within the same department who are, buddies with, co-instructors, sometimes the managers of, the training program. And so you need to have somebody, that's somewhat outside that internal circle being helping with the audits. Maybe that's somebody, a quality management department within your own organization. Maybe that's a third-party auditor that you're hiring, from another training provider or industry partner. It talks about, they mention practical exercises that need to simulate the wind turbine environment. Sometimes that's a little bit lacking. And they also said that doing the minimum, meeting exactly what the learning objective says, meets the standard. But doing things a little bit extra, having stories, having various equipment, getting creative with your scenarios and stuff like that, all of that really adds value and puts a really good perception, not only in the participants, but the auditor as well. What they also said is, training providers that have a strong training background are also tend not to be very well versed on management systems. One of them told me that if they're going into a company that's been delivering training for years and years and years, maybe within the wind industry, maybe not, they really focus on their management systems. And then if they're going into a company who's a massive organization, ISO certified, all of that stuff, they tend to focus more on the training program. And that's not exactly a rule, but that's just kind of some of the feedback I got. Initial instructor qualifications can often be difficult for new training providers. Again, if you need to reach out to me to help find and connect with some people that can help you through that initial certification process, I'm here to help. And then the last one, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that risk assessments are often not well understood. And specifically, a risk assessment is not a job safety analysis, JSA, tailboard, whatever you want to call them. JSAs tend to be that, hey, we're going to go work today. What are the conditions that we're encountering today based off of our people, based off of our situation? The risk assessment is that step back before work is ever done, before tools or equipment are ever used or structures are ever used, and really looking at severity and likelihood of risk and what are the process level, equipment level things that we can do to even prevent those incidents from ever happening. And as I mentioned, you might need some help through this process. There's a couple different ways to get help through the certification process. And I put those into two categories. If you're going for independent certification, meaning that your organization wants to get your own certification, but you need somebody to kind of help you get there. There's different ways that you can reach out to partners for consultancy, maybe have somebody come in and help you evaluate your current program, do a gap analysis, look at your equipment, make some recommendations. There's a lot of different ways to approach that. Instructor development, looking for partner organizations to help, potentially with that initial certification process. Or, some companies will partner with you to either license or sell training material, or maybe even come in and help you develop your training content to meet the learning objectives of the GWO training program. But again, those are kind of the partnerships that tend to enable a training provider to become their own independent certified company. And then there's what I call direct partnerships. And those kind of come in two categories. One of them is to work with an existing training provider who can essentially bring your facility under their certification. So it's like a partnership where they are the ones that certified, it's their management systems, their instructors, but they come to your location and deliver the training. And there's a lot of different ways that you can slice that up. Sometimes it can be mutually beneficial for both, because maybe you don't want to have a whole training program, but maybe that training provider can also come in and utilize your facility for some, commercial training as well. So it could be a benefit, but there's a lot of different ways to make those arrangements. And then that last one is kind of what I call a franchise model, where you partner with a larger training provider, utilize their curriculum, utilize their instructor development process, but utilize your facility and your instructors that are all certified under their GWO certification. And that's a little bit more of an involved partnership. Again, it can take many different forms based off of the agreement that you come to with the training provider. But again, if you have any questions about potential partnerships, reach out to me. I can help connect you with different training providers in the region. There's some international companies that support the region as well. Depending upon what you're looking for, I can kind of help steer you in a few different directions and give you those contacts. So we're coming towards the end. And so after, going through a lot of this, you may be a little overwhelmed, you may be a little bit bewildered, but I want to ask, how you're feeling about this. And the first question you're going to see on the poll is, what do you see after going through those four elements? What do you see as the biggest obstacle for your organization to adopt GWO training? And then the second question, which you can actually choose multiple answers for this one, is if you are considering GWO certification, which modules will your organization pursue for your initial certification? You know, some people look at just a few to get in the door. Some people look at multiple modules so that they can kind of get more of a broad portfolio. But you should see the poll on your screen. And so go ahead and take a moment to answer those. I see a few coming in right now. Here's what we're looking at. So a little pretty broad spread on the different obstacles. Everybody's looking at the BST core. A few are looking at the BC survival, BTT core. So pretty much what expected. You know, those core modules are pretty critical. We got some advanced rescue elements in there, which is great. Enhanced first aid as well. I think there's a couple off the lower part of the screen. Blade repair. Yep, lift user, rigor signal person. Great. So I'm going to leave that poll up for a little bit if you guys want to keep answering as it's coming in.